Very often people come to me and they say, Frank, when is the culture war going to end? They have this idea that the culture war has reached the peak. They think that we've seen so much of woke that it's impossible to think that there's any more to come. They have this idea that somehow our enemies have become exhausted, that somehow they're going to say, okay, the culture war has gone so far, but now we're going to lay down our arms and retire in California, or where we actually belong. But actually, when you look at what's happening throughout the Western world, you realize that the culture war is actually just beginning. You have to realize that the culture war is not something that was made up by newspaper journalists, by editorials. The culture war is something that has been fought in a very one-sided way for a long time. One of the reasons why I'm here, and I think what NatCon is doing is really so important, is because for a very, very long time, the conservative side just sat there and laughed. Every time they heard some crazy, politically correct word being used, they said, ho, 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 ho. Ho, 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 ho. They're not using the pronoun he and she. Ho, ho, ho. Isn't that really funny? And they were laughing a lot. And then one morning you wake up and you realize that actually, throughout the educational system in the Anglo-American world, they're introducing all these sort of weird pronouns. And that becomes the norm. And that our children come home from school and give us little lectures about why we shouldn't call their friend he rather than them. And we laughed for 20, 30 years. We laughed, I remember the very first time, I was fairly young, when the word chairman was challenged. And a lot of my colleagues said, they want to call us chairpersons. Ho, 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 isn't that funny? What's a chairperson? Look at it 20 or 30 years ago, and people are really, really scared to use the old name. So conservatives have been extremely lazy and complacent and did nothing intellectually. They basically sat around and did literally, I always remember this experience I had 20 years ago. I was invited to the American Enterprise Institute to talk about my new book on risk. And there were all these guys there who used to be academics like myself. And I asked them, what are you doing hiding in the American Enterprise Institute? Why are you there? And they said, well, Frank, we respect you. You're in a university. But why should we expose ourselves to these institutions which are dominated by the left, by the liberals, by the politically correct people? And I said, well, one of the reasons why our opponents are in ascendancy in the universities is because guys like you look for safe spaces in think tanks. Guys like you have decided that it is not our job to try to teach young people in the universities about our points of view. I said to them, and these are American, fairly well-off people, how would you respond to the question, or would you like your daughter or your son to become a teacher? Do you think that's a good profession? Do you think that's a profession that has got respect and authority? And they looked at me like I was an idiot. Why would I want my children to go to a school, a public school? Can you imagine teaching in a public school? I'd rather my kids went to New York, to Wall Street. They went into business. They basically went in and got a good job. And basically what they were saying is that we're worried about what the teachers and the education system is doing in America, but we're not prepared to have our side of the story being told. We're not prepared to have children being exposed to our ideas, and instead what we're doing is we're letting the left control the school system. So I think that when we look at ourselves, the problem lies with us as much as with the other side. We haven't really understood the importance of waging an intellectual alternative in the way it needs to be done. I think one of the things that Yoram has done is that he's written books that are serious, they are deep, they actually raise important questions that are very rarely engaged with in the contemporary era. The trouble is there's only one Yoram, right? I mean, that's a big problem. You know, we need a lot more, and we also need Yorams that are maybe 20 years younger, and are, no, I'm serious, 20 years younger, and are coming up in the intellectual system, and can play a role in mobilizing on our behalf against the world we live in. You know, the culture war, people think, is about what they're doing about gender, it's about what they're saying about this and that. But I think the culture war is something that is being fought out most importantly in schools, in nurseries. I mean, the reason why I feel so passionate about the culture war is because over the last 20, 30 years, we lost 4 or 5 generations of young people to people who are on the wrong side. They won without having to do very much because they never had to argue seriously against what we've got to say. The culture war is being fought by schools where they basically have decided that even sex education is not good enough. They now have a phenomenon called sexuality education. And if you look at the curriculum of sexuality education, it's got nothing to do with sex, if you would imagine. It's everything about what identity you want to cultivate at the age of 6, 7, or 8. It's all about forcing down gender ideology on our children. And imagine, right, there are all these kids learning sexuality education. The parents don't know about it. We don't know about it until one thing happened. I think the best thing that happened was COVID, right? Now, you might think I'm being weird by saying that COVID was a really good thing. But what happened during COVID was that a lot of parents listened in on the Zoom discussions that children had with their teachers. A lot of parents heard what the teachers were teaching them about Black Lives Matter, about sexuality, about gender and everything else. And a lot of parents woke up to the fact that the world was changing, that their parents, their children, were being indoctrinated with ideas that went right against what they believed in. I think that's something that we have to remember, and we have to work on a strategy of how we can win back the schools, how we can win back education. You know, earlier on, our friend was speaking about civilization. Where's Robert? Yeah. And I think that it's possible to believe that to use the word civilization is too strong. It's possible to think that when we talk about civilizational issues, we're exaggerating. But actually, when push comes to shove, you have to realize that these issues are of civilizational consequences. One of the things about civilization, and this is to me the most important thing about Western civilization, is that it's based upon the idea of the sense of permanence. Unless you have a sense of permanence, people are not going to grow food in the countryside. People are not going to build cities. They're not going to build walls. They're not going to build temples. They're not going to write Bibles if we think that nothing is permanent, everything is fluid, then essentially our way of life becomes entirely arbitrary and nothing gets done. And today, the battles you are fighting is actually civilizational. I think so much is at stake in the culture war that it cannot be over-exaggerated. To me, this is, in many respects, the key thing. And I think that the central issue for us, something we need to take more seriously about the culture war, is that at the end of the day, it's not just about gender, it's not just simply about LGBTQ, anything of that sort. At the end of the day, it's about our past. Everything that's being done by our enemies is designed to make us feel ashamed about where we come from, makes us feel ashamed about our origins and about our roots. It's an attempt to detach ourselves from our past. It's an attempt to make us feel that somehow Greek civilization was a civilization based on slavery, that Greek democracy is a joke because it was based on slaves, that somehow the Greeks were the inventors of white supremacy. They're writing books about Aristotle, which claimed that Aristotle was the first philosopher who put forward the ideas about white privilege. They're basically taking Shakespeare apart, arguing that Shakespeare, when you look at his writings, is really a racist writer who's responsible for the kind of world that has become. Literally every single major figure in the canon of Western civilization has been attacked and called into question. And we got to stand up for them and have the courage to actually fight them. Now, I want to end on by saying one thing that hasn't been discussed at this conference yet. There's something insidious about the other side of the culture war. They haven't got an ideology, but somehow you know how they're going to react to everything. So when October the 7th happened, when that horrific event happened in southern Israel, you just knew that the people who loved Black Lives Matter, who thought that transgenderist ideology was the high point of human culture, who imagined that the LGBTQ rainbow flag was more important than the flag of their nations, you knew that all these people would come to the conclusion that they have more in common with Hamas than with the Israelis that were being destroyed in a pogrom of unprecedented matter. You just knew that from the woke point of view, Hamas is much more closer to them than a civilized nation like Israel. And that is something that we need to take very, very seriously, because it tells us that the culture represented by the LGBTQ mob aren't just simply very funny drag artists, harmless drag artists who are having fun at our expense. They're just not simply individuals who are playing around with pronouns. They're not just simply people who enjoy calling out our white privilege. These are people whose ethos, whose way of life is a danger to humanity, a direct threat to humanity. These are people that would destroy everything about our civilization if they had half a chance, who intuitively, viscerally reject everything that is good about the world we live in, who do not even believe that it's possible to make a distinction between right and wrong. You know, in America, they say that non-judgmentalism is much better, it's a higher value than making judgments. They actually think that when we say something is evil, something is wrong, we're being judgy. That kind of attitude has created a situation where, in a sense, unless we stand up and fight, unless we have the courage to do what we've done today, unless we take seriously some of the key fundamental ideas that national conservative thinkers have put forward, we're in big trouble. Right? There's very few of us at the moment. The stakes are high, but I really, truly believe that the kind of ideas you heard today and you're going to hear tomorrow can change the world in such a way that we can regain what is good about the world we come from, that can somehow create a world where our values is seen by a new generation of people as being good. You know, one of the things that I feel really great about is when I go around France, Netherlands, Italy, and other places, I see young people finally joining the fight. I go to meetings, and I see young people attending these meetings from Portugal to France and identifying with our kinds of values. That has not happened before. Not since the 60s have we had a young generation of people move to our side. And what we've got to do is to embrace them, cultivate them, educate them, make them strong so that they can become the future leaders of national conservatism. That's what it's worth fighting for. Thank you.